Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Logan Ketterling. He's a pastor and director of influence, where he oversees and leads digital strategy and annual conference, book and music publishing, and leadership and training resources at River Valley Church in Minnesota. He's also the host of Talking Church, where he and his guests discuss trends in church and culture. In today's episode, Logan and I are going to talk about the role the podcast plays in the overall digital strategy of River Valley Network, how he prepares for interviews with well-known guests like Dave Ramsey, for example, and what it's going to take to achieve some of his 2024 goals for the podcast. So let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Logan Ketterling. Well, Logan, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I first heard about Talking Church, the podcast that you host, when my wife showed me a reel with you and George, and you were in the cold of the Minnesota winter, and you did this reel called Cold Takes with George. It was a lot of fun, the questions you got to ask him. And from there, we were like, oh, who's this guy? What's this podcast? And we dug in a little bit, my wife and I, and saw that you had George on your podcast, and you've had Dave Ramsey on your podcast, and I used to work at Ramsey Solutions. And so I was like, oh, let's have him on the show and chat about the journey that you've had in podcasting as you've been doing it for several years now. So let's go back those few years to when you started as the director of influence at River Valley Church, and that was back in September of 2020. And then a year later, you started publishing the podcast, which is called Talking Church. And so I'd love to hear the journey from taking that role to then starting the podcast.
Yeah, it's kind of a bougie title, right? A pastor of influence, director of influence, and I joke about it a lot, but it really does encompass what I do. I'm not an influencer, although we do try to influence the global church with what we do. And so one of our main goals in our influence department is to help resource pastors and church leaders. And so because of that, we've had the River Valley Network. We were previously doing master classes before I was overseeing the network. And if you're familiar with master class, it's, a series of videos and kind of teaches you how we do what we do. And it was behind a email paywall. It wasn't a charge for it, but we tried to gather people's emails. And when I went into the role, I saw how much work those took to put on, and they were really well done. But the unfortunate truth of it was, by the time we edited and did all the work behind it, some of the relevancy had lost its way. And then the second part of it is the view counts on those, because it was behind an email capture, were so low compared to maybe what other people would expect. And so, some of the videos we would put, tons of hours of work into, and they'd get 12, 13 views on them. And so you're thinking, those 12 and 13 views, maybe half of them are the team just checking to make sure that it works right. And so it was a lot of great effort, but I don't think it was achieving the goal. And so that's where you mentioned about a year in. So what if we just do a podcast that we can release it, weekly? And that's, it's pretty popular right now. It wasn't as popular as it is even now, which is crazy to think. I thought we were kind of at its peak at that point, and now I think we're not even near the peak of where podcasting is.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really just a way for us to train pastors and train people with, here's how we at River Valley Church do what we do. And from there, it's taken a whole different shape, and I'm excited to just see where it goes from here. But that's kind of how it started, was just a replacement of master classes to make it easier to film and just to get content out to people quicker.
Yeah, so what have you seen as you've started doing that and publishing the podcast now for 3 years about, how have you seen that impact difference? You're saying just a few views here, and now the podcast has been very successful. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think anecdotally, in the podcast world, you have analytics and then you have anecdotes. I think the analytics are super exciting for me because I see all the numbers, but there are times where, you can get caught up. And I think this is the same with church leaders, with business leaders, is you have 1 month where sales are down and you feel like the world is ending, or you have a bad attendance month and the world's over. And I think the same can be true in podcasting world. We've seen our numbers go up and up and up. And then I mean, truly just being candid, there's weeks that go by that an episode doesn't resonate with people. And I'm like, oh, that's just so hard. But then this last week I was at a conference and I had probably 8 people come up to me and say, I love your podcast. I'm super inspired by it. It's really helpful to me. And so to have that happen as frequently as it did was way more encouraging than looking at the analytic charts and seeing what episodes are performing well. And so I think doing both is helpful, but just anecdotally experiencing those stories and those testimonies from people who feel they've been impacted by it. We've had stories of people who are dealing with suicide that shared their testimonies. And he shared with me that many people reached out to him saying, I feel like I was in a similar situation and this has helped me so much. So it's evolved from just a practical ministry to actually doing transformational ministry. And we still try to remain practical on our podcast because we don't want to lose our way. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit in terms of audience. But it's been just exciting to see it grow. And I never thought it would get as big as it is now. And, we're not a massive podcast, but even to have people like Dave Ramsey, like you mentioned, and George on the show has been incredible.
Yeah. So since you brought it up, I would love to hear, what is the audience that you're going after? So it seemed like the masterclass was pretty specific. It sounds like the podcast has broadened that. What does that look like?
Yeah, we started very much for pastors and people who are working at a church. And I would say there are episodes we do that are more for the broader church, but I've had to be disciplined to remain focused on the goal has been church leaders. And so that's I've broadened it to say church leaders because I know there are people who are bivocational pastors, there are deacons, there are elders, there are people who are strong volunteers in the church. It's not necessarily a podcast for new believers who don't know the lingo. I think that there are amazing podcasts for that. And, I lead another one for our local church that is just like the River Valley podcast where we just answer questions from people in our church that are more kind of apologetics based or just let's process that. This is more for the seasoned believer, people who are in leadership at church that resonate with that. So I've had to fight against vision creep to where I've tried to think, if I have a broader audience, I can reach more people. And even though that can be true for some, I think for me, I've had to remain focused that no, the reason this church is supporting this podcast is because this is for pastors and leaders, which is the role that I'm in and what I'm paid to do. And so I have tried to remain focused on that, and then occasionally have testimonies and things like I mentioned that can break up the sequence, but not be the norm. We want the norm to be practical help, leadership help, and church leader focused.
Nice. Yeah. So as part of that, one of the pieces of your role is digital strategy. And so I'm interested how, what you're talking about there, how the podcast plays into that overall digital strategy.
Yeah, digital strategy is something that many churches, I think, are still trying to wrap their heads around, and I would say we are too. So if anyone thinks, River Valley, you have it figured out because, you've been doing it this long, it's just not true. It's always changing, and everyone sees that. The way I've thought about digital strategy is we have to think about platforms as almost like different campuses, if that were to make sense for people, or different, stores, because Instagram is reaching a totally different audience. That's how you found out about the podcast.
Yeah.
But for many people who find us on Instagram, they'll never go to YouTube, they'll never go to Apple Podcasts, but they will maybe follow us on Instagram and see our clips. I mean, our clips have reached, I think, 5 or 6 million people, over the last year. And so that alone, I think, is something that is an incredible impact. But when you look at the analytics of the downloads on the podcast, it's not 5 or 6 million people. And so I've just had to think about digital strategy with what does the Instagram audience crave, or what is the algorithm going to support? And I don't want to be too algorithm heavy because you can focus on controversy and just get a lot of clicks and views, but does that remain your brand? And so those are things I wrestle with. But I actually have been more focused on Instagram to try and be a little bit less practical and more inspirational. And then on the longer conversations, people can get some of those practical things. So I think with digital strategy, you have to think about it like each platform is its own creature, it's its own personality. Of course, TikTok and Instagram and Facebook are going to have very different personalities. So those are things I try to think about both in the podcast and at the church.
Yeah. That's a good way to think about it because, they are so different. And as part of that, you are using content from the podcast for Instagram to throw on Reels. How do you and your team choose, this is the clip that's going to resonate most with that audience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's the question everyone in podcasting is asking. We want to do the clips that get viral. And we've had the privilege to have, I think, 6 or 7 that have got over 500,000 views or close to it. And, our most viewed is 1.7 million, which is crazy. And I think that the big thing that I think about is relatability when it comes to Instagram specifically. Instagram algorithm, from my understanding, and again, I'm not someone who works for Meta and is an expert, but again, just from my experience, it seems that sharing is far more important to Instagram than even interaction. That's the highest interaction is sharing, and then saving kind of being the second. And then of course you have likes and comments that follow that. View time is important as well, just like it is on YouTube. But I find that sharing and view time tend to be the metrics for Instagram. So, as like any video, does it have a good hook? Does it live up to the title? Like we try to put like a title at the beginning of it or have a caption that relates to it, or does it relate to the hook that you just used? And then does it resolve? I think the reason why most of our posts that go, viral, so to speak, or at least get more views than followers is people see the resolve and then they want to share it. I think a lot of videos are really good in a podcast, but the difficult part of a podcast, as well as a sermon, as well as a TED Talk or whatever, is you're taking a clip just out of it. And so you have to find a clip that resolves itself. Otherwise, people, they don't want to share it because it feels like it hasn't been finished yet. And so I've really tried my best to have stories within podcast or moments within podcast that start with a good hook, but even greater than that, they end with a resolve that doesn't leave you going, that didn't answer my full question. And so I often find the reels that are most popular, they almost feel like they could have just been that 1 minute was all it was, and it was recorded just for Instagram. And so I think that has been helpful for us to think about. And the other thing is, Craig Rochelle said this, and this has kind of been a theme for our team for the last few months. He shares a term called GETMO, which is good enough to move on. And I think you have to have those posts that are, hey, it's not the perfect viral post. It's not going to be the one that reaches hundreds of thousands of people, but you need something, and you can't think everyone is going to be viral, but occasionally one will jump, and that's awesome.
Yeah. So we've mentioned the River Valley Network a couple of times, and in podcasting, a lot of people think automatically, oh, that's a podcast network, but it's not. It's a different type of network. So I'd love for you to share with us what the network is about and how the podcast is a part of it.
Yeah, the network really is the core part of what I do. And the podcast is kind of the top of the funnel to get people involved. The funny thing about our network is we are a self-funded network and we get sponsors. And so we don't charge people for really anything, with the exception of in-person events to pay for some of the food and activities. We're not trying to sign people up for a long-term program and do that. And so I think in some ways people are confused by that. But really our heart for the network is we just want to help the church. God has done something in our church for the last 28 years. We have 11 locations here in the Twin Cities. We have multiple international locations. God has done something through what we call Kingdom Builders, which is our above the tithe giving. And so a big goal of our network is to help train. And again, these numbers sound crazy, but we want to train 10,000 churches to annually give over $1 billion away to missions and church planting. And so this past year, we sent a survey out to all those we've coached. We've coached about 1,000 churches thus far, and we only got like a 15% response rate, which I'm trying to improve the survey response rate. But of that, those churches gave $58 million to those projects and initiatives. Wow. And so it's incredible just to see what God is doing through our network, and we're inviting people to be a part. We have what's called Generosity Accelerator. We've done 27 of them around the nation over the last 3 years, and we have many more scheduled where we say, hey, learn from us on what we do. We're not saying we're the end all be all, but God has done something through our church. We've learned a lot over the last 15 years of doing this, going from giving, a few $100,000 a year to last year giving away 10 million just as our church. And so we just want to inspire people to say, don't think inwardly with your church of how big of a building can I get or how much money can I have in the bank. Think externally to say, how much good can we, as the richest nation in the world, of this size, 80% of Christianity's wealth is in America. And so let's use that to help fuel the mission around the world. And so we're unashamed about that, and we train pastors to do it, and it's exciting to do.
Yeah, that's a really cool initiative. So I'd love to dive into some of the behind the scenes of the podcast. So you, as I was listening to some episodes and watching a few, I noticed that you do a great job interviewing your guests. And so I'd love to hear, what's your process to prepare for an interview?
Yeah, thank you for that. Sometimes I feel like I do a good job. Other times I feel like I didn't. And so I do find, though, that listening to myself after every episode is very helpful. And some people don't like to do that because they're afraid, or other people might say, well, that sounds kind of arrogant that you listen to yourself. I just think if you want to be good at your craft, you need to practice. And one of the best ways to practice when it comes to talking and doing an interview is listening back to what you've done. And so it's hard to practice an interview, but it is kind of funny sometimes. Like Dave, for example, I know you've had Dave and you worked for him.
Yeah.
I actually did write a lot of questions in advance and was almost like rehearsing what he would say. I watched a lot of interviews. I watched a couple podcasts that he did with pastors who interviewed him. Craig Rochelle was one of them, because I didn't want to ask the same questions other people had asked, but I also wanted to have some information in advance. You've done your research here and talking to me right now. And so I think when it's somebody that I don't know very well, I'm really going to try to do my research to know what angle. And I think when I say angle, I don't mean angle that I'm trying to push people to. The biggest thing that I've been searching for is great conversations happen when somebody talks about what they're passionate about. And so whenever I'm in an interview, I don't want to talk about what I want to talk about. I want to find what they're passionate about. The difficult part of people is they're passionate about different things at different times. And so even using Dave as an example, Dave may be really passionate to talk about politics at one point, but maybe another time he'd say, I don't know, that's not really interesting to me right now. But he's always probably interested in talking about getting people out of debt. And so really trying to find what are those things that right now today, as I'm sitting across from them or on a call with them, what are they curious about and passionate about that they want to talk about? Because I think that's what's interesting to people and trying to make it as relevant as they can. And then the last thing I would say is really just trying to think about the audience. I try to think about myself as I am an audience member listening that just so happens to be sitting in the room with this person. And so when there's something said that I think the audience might not be familiar with, I just recorded an episode yesterday to where I said to the person I was talking to, hey, maybe people aren't aware of what that is. Can you expand upon that? Even though I knew, I'm trying to take a position of the audience member. So I think those are things that I've tried to practice. Honestly, I don't have as scripted of things as some do. That's more just my style because I kind of am open for it to flow, and I just can't be too scripted because otherwise I'll get bored. But with the guests that are a little bit higher, like I don't want to say like higher quality, but just more influential, there's more nerves. I mean, the Dave Ramsey episode for us has been viewed over 30,000 times. And so that's a lot of eyes that are on this episode. So I want to be more prepared. And, you know, some people do ask, hey, can you have the questions in advance for me? Other people don't care at all. And so I try to ebb and flow with their personality as well.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. Driving for the passion and being curious, I've found, as I've worked at Ramsey for 5 years, was key to having good interviews. Because when it kind of falls flat, it's because either, you didn't put enough research into it, or they're not passionate about the thing that you're trying to talk about. And so, driving for that is key. And as I was watching on YouTube, I could see your notes in front of you, and I saw that there's some color coding that you do. Tell me about that.
Yeah, the color coding that I was doing on some of the episodes that I have more notes on is generally what are the questions that I have to ask? What are the questions that if it comes up, I would ask? And then the other one is kind of if there's extra time, I'll ask. And so there was kind of some questions for Dave that I felt these are the ones that are must ask. But there was others that I felt if it comes up, it would be a good time to do it, but it might be out in left field if it doesn't come up. So that was kind of how I did those color codings, just to make sure that I was hitting those yellow highlights, I think were the ones. But I don't always do that, but I would say I've done it in probably 5 or 6 interviews. The ones that, again, I don't really have as strong of a relationship with the person beforehand. You know, I had met Dave that day. And so to meet him that day and then to interview him on a very public stage, I wanted to be more prepared. Whereas if I'm interviewing my father, I don't feel the necessary, to have the notes in front of me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. For those type of interviews that you're interviewing your dad or you're interviewing somebody else that you're more familiar with, what kind of preparation do you put into those? Or is it kind of like, hey, here's the main topic, let's just go?
Yeah, usually the latter. There are times where we'll have more preparation. Certain hot topics, I'll talk to the guest a little bit more in advance just to make sure that we know what direction. I try to be respectful of them and their platform, but I also am very clear. I was on the phone call with someone the other day and they said, I don't know if I would say it like that. And I was like, well, it's my podcast, so I can say it however I want, respectfully. But I do try to respect them and their platforms as well. And so I would say the people I have strong relationships with, it really is that. It's, hey, here's a topic, let's talk about it, and let's see where it goes. But the less of a relationship, the more prepared I'm going to be.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So as we talked through the podcast, and I saw that you put some goals together for yourself, and some of those were for the podcast for 2024. So I'd love to first ask, what have you found to be the benefit of setting goals for the podcast?
I think it helps to know why you're doing what you're doing. And I'm an Enneagram 3 achiever. And so that's part of it is just I'm a goal setter, I'm an achiever. There's nothing more than that on some degrees. But then on the other hand, I think it helps the team. I have a team of people that helps me with the podcast. And so it helps them know, are we achieving what we want to achieve? Are we not? I don't feel super strongly about cracking a whip and saying, we're not hitting the goals. But I do think, like anything, if you believe in it and you think that the episodes are good, or you think that the work you're doing is good, or the product you sell, or the church you lead is impacting people, you want more people to be a part of it. I just think that's a mindset of people who really believe in what they're doing. And so to me, I love getting stopped at conferences when people say that episode's impacting me. I don't need to do this for myself. I've actually been very bashful in trying to post of myself. My team has been telling me, you need to post more reels of you on the podcast because you're the one who's hosted. You've done 116 episodes and you've posted probably 5 clips of you in its entirety of just you talking. And so that's something that I need to get over as well. But I think the goals are helpful for me just to know, okay, we're reaching the people we want to reach. We're actually putting effort versus just saying, we'll see where it goes and wherever it leads. No, I want to put effort to make sure that the hard work that our team and our film team and our audio team and our digital team is putting into this, that we're reaching as many people as possible. Because you know as well as I do, the amount of work you put in on an episode versus the amount of viewers, you can have 1 million viewers. The work on the episode's pretty much the same. Now, maybe there's better, intros and there's better guests that you have, but by and large, the episode that you do, it can be viewed like it's an infinite return on your investment of the podcast itself. Whereas if you're speaking into a room of 10,000 people, there's a limit to the capacity. Whereas with YouTube and with audio podcasts, there's no limit to how many people can listen.
Yeah, so a couple of the goals that you put down, I'd love to chat about them for a second. One was building out a new podcast studio. And so I'd love to hear what the vision is there and what that's going to look like.
Yeah, so I'm actually taking this call from my office because our podcast studio is kind of in the middle of moving over. And so we've been in a rented facility next to one of our locations for the past year because we actually sold the building that our studio was in. And so now we're in our new, we call it central office building. And so we have a brand new podcast studio that's almost finished. And so I'm very, very excited about that. And so the goal of it is not just to be for Talking Church, but at our church, we have other podcasts we do. We do a lot of quick filming for, hey, we need a quick greeting for this, or we need a quick announcement for this. And so we also have that goal for that studio to be a use case for that. I don't want it just to be Logan Studio, but we do have the gear set up to where the goal of the podcast studio is for gear to be captured and edited and sent out as quickly as possible. So that's kind of how we're building out the gear in that studio to make things easy to cut, easy to master, and then have a space where we can dedicate to devoting this versus right now we're having to move cameras back and forth because we've been double dipping with our film team. And so we actually just purchased a set of cameras for our podcast studio that is going to be devoted to that space so that at any time, any of our podcasts or any of our short form products can go in there and capture it, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that's huge. We had that same kind of a thing at Ramsey. We had a studio, but for the longest time, we were taking cameras and setting them up every time. And it's a lot of work to continue to do that week after week after week. And so, yeah, having dedicated equipment, if you can, especially, and then using it for multi-purpose, that it makes sense to, hey, we'll set this room up to do all kinds of things. That's fantastic. So one of the other goals that you put down was to have 250,000 podcast downloads. So what do you think it'll take to hit that number?
Yeah, it was an ambitious goal because it was about 2.5 times more than we had last year. And the way I view podcast downloads for us is both on YouTube views of our podcast episodes as well as audio downloads. Yeah. And so we were right about 100,000 last year. And so that was a pretty big jump for us and on pace to go about double of what we had last year, which is really exciting. Although I don't have a Dave Ramsey episode quite yet, which was viewed, as I mentioned, a lot. And so I'm a little behind in the YouTube area, but I'm ahead in the audio side. And I think it's going to take, a lot of guests are really sought after. And you say, I want to get a really high profile guest. But I found topics to actually be the thing that performs better. And the key in the synergistic side of that is when you get a great topic with a great guest. And so that tends to be the best performing videos. And so trying to do my best to have great topics and great guests together. And also, I think in person is something I valued. And I know we're on digital right now, but just for me, I found it's easier to clip out the in-person content because we have higher quality video. And so I do occasionally have, using the tool that we're using right now, do episodes, but I've just valued in person because it gives me that flexibility on social media clips. The actual audio conversations, the audio quality, I don't think is much different at all in person versus over tools that they've made it so much better.
Yeah.
But the social media side, I do think people see a difference in clipping out a digital versus an in-person thing. So those are just things that I've kind of been focused on. I'm hoping that we can do it. Like I said, we're on a good pace, but we need to increase. And I have some cool series ideas this summer that I'm hoping that will kind of elevate that to do some mini series related to topics. I've seen Carrie Newhoff do some of that, and I think it's been cool. So trying to incorporate my own flavor into that as well.
Nice. Yeah. Series is an interesting way to go about it sometimes because there's, people have seasons frequently. And then I've seen series go one of two ways. Either it alienates people because the topic is too niche when you do it, or it goes really well. And usually, at least how we saw it at Ramsey, was like either people really like it or they really don't. And so, yeah, series can go really well as long as you get the right guests and pick a topic that really resonates. And so, yeah, series is a great idea when you can marry those two really well. And you had mentioned that you have a team around you that helps produce the podcast as video and audio. So I'd love to hear, what does that look like working with the team and who all is involved?
Yeah, I think we're unique in that as a church of the size that we have and scale, the teams that we have, there's no one person dedicated fully to the podcast. However, we do have the luxury that we have a large team, a large creative team that people can uniquely devote to this. And so we have somebody who oversees audio production here at our church, and he kind of helps oversee the audio production of the podcast. We have a team of people that oversee video production and film. And so they're able to help oversee the podcast. So I understand and I want to fully acknowledge the luxury that I have, but to kind of drill down specifically on what their roles are, it's not everyone from the film team, everyone from our audio production team. We have one person from film that's there making sure all the cameras are set up properly and that the lighting is good and that the focus is in check. And then we have an audio person that actually is we run 2 rigs at the same time because, funny story, we've always run a redundancy rig. So we always run 2 rigs that capture audio just in case it happens. And the one time, and this is not a joke, the one time our redundancy rig wasn't working is when our system crashed. It has never crashed in over 100 episodes, except for the time our redundancy rig wasn't working. And so that reminds me of Dave when he says, like, it's Murphy's Law, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think it's funny. So we have one audio person, one film person, and then typically we have either my assistant or one of my other team members helping host guests because I do record 2 to 3 at a time. I try not to go too far in advance. That's just my style because I really want it to be relevant. But I'll record at the beginning of a month and those episodes will release throughout the month, and then I'll record one at the end of the month and kind of stagger from there. I found if I do more than 3 episodes at a time, my brain starts getting fried and I just can't even think about what's going on. Other times I'll record an episode. For this week, I recorded it on Wednesday and it's coming out on the following Tuesday. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. There's other times I've recorded it the day before and just asked the team to stretch. And so some of the tools we're starting to use allow us to do that. And one of them was Autopod. And I found that out by a friend of mine, Omar. And he told me about it. He has a great podcast on YouTube as well about personal brands. And it is an AI switcher that cuts for you. And literally the amount of time it saves, because we were actually doing live switching where there was someone in the room that was switching the cameras. And what I found is that person can't compete because you don't know when I'm going to stop talking. Whereas if you do it later, it's a much better switching product, but it takes forever if you do it later. And so this Autopod feature, we've started using it only in the last month. And truly, it has been amazing. And so I couldn't recommend it more.
Yeah, I've messed around with Autopod. It's a plugin that you can use in Premiere. But yeah, it's great to be able to select these are the video channels that we have, and here's the audio, and it just analyzes the audio and switches the camera based on that. And it's fantastic to just watch it go
Yeah.
through and just cut everything up. It analyzes it and then just runs through it, and it's like, this is amazing. I actually used it. So when I interviewed Dave Ramsey, I was like, it would be a mistake to not record this. And well, I record everything on video for social clips, but then I was like, it would be amiss to not publish this as a full video episode as well. And I was like, I don't have enough time to switch it all myself in Premiere. And so I was like, I should just try it. And I did, and it worked out great. I had to make some tweaks, and that's just how any tool like that works. But it beats going through and manually, even if you make it a multicam sequence and you're still switching the camera, you still have to watch through it live, and it's like, oh wait, no, I want to switch that one. So yeah, it's fantastic. That's a great tool if people are doing video podcasts to check out for sure. So now as you look back, you've been doing this for almost 4 years as a podcast host. How has doing the podcast helped amplify the mission and grow the ministry of the River Valley Network?
I don't know that I can even express how much it's grown the network. I think that people are looking to trust people, and podcasts are such a great way to build trust with your audience. For me, the network is what I'm asked to do. There's other things that are on my portfolio, as everyone who does in their job. It's, responsibilities as needed. Yep. But to me, this was a way for us to build the audience and build a funnel for people who want help in growing their church, who want help in giving more to missions, giving more to church planting, helping grow their local church in that area. And so to talk about things that are relevant to them has been super important. And I found that I don't need to talk about just the things our network does. And so the episodes that I do are relevant to that group of people. They don't necessarily relate to generosity or relate to growing your church bigger, although some do, but they relate to my audience and add value to them. And so it has grown us a ton. I mean, again, I've never been the person to get stopped at a conference before and say, hey, I love what you do. And again, that's not why I do it, but it's more just cool to say, I've seen that with my father. I've seen that with other people that I've been connected to. But to have people coming up to me and saying, hey, I would love for you to speak at my event, or I would love to you to be on my podcast, I'm very appreciative of that. And I know it's easy to maybe become arrogant or feel like it's about me. And I consider it just, no, look, God is using me. I don't think it's wrong that people are appreciative, but I never want it to be about me. And so it's grown it a lot. I mean, our events are full. Our conference almost sold out last year. I'm expecting it to sell out this year. And so,
nice.
Yeah, it's definitely been an amazing opportunity just using the podcast to build trust with our audience.
Yeah. That's one thing that I keep telling people that I work with is podcasting is great for building trust because people are spending time with you. I'm trying to remember who it was that I had on was talking about, if you listen to a podcast weekly that's 30 to 60 minutes long, you potentially are spending more time with that podcast host than your dad, for example. And so it's interesting to see that play out too. And then that manifests in people coming up to you that you have no clue who they are. They've spent hours and hours with you. And so they feel like they know you and build trust that way. And it's a great way to then bring people along on a journey of, hey, this is how we can help you grow. And people are here for that.
And I would just encourage anyone who has a podcast is listening. And again, I know that's kind of primarily people who are here, is the amount of people listening should not determine why you do your podcast, because you can build trust with 20 or 30 people, and even getting your external process out to meet with that many people. I mean, we know how calendars are these days. It's crazy. And so that's actually been something that one of our other pastors, Kirk and I, the podcast that we lead for our church, has been, we can't set up meetings with all these people and answer every question. But if we say, what questions do you have this week? This could be helpful. And so that podcast, it's been audio only for a while. We'll be moving to video soon. But it's really just a way to interact with our congregation. And the amount of people that have come up to us and said, I've never felt comfortable asking a pastor this type of question before, but you've made it comfortable for me. Well, that's an amazing opportunity that everyone has in their business. It may be 10 people listening, 20 people listening, but the amount of work that it takes to put out your thoughts, I think you will improve and get better. But I just would encourage, again, at some point there is a diminishing return to say the opportunity cost. But I think for many people, don't think about thousands and tens of thousands and millions. Think about who are the people in my circle today that I can impact. And then if you're doing great episodes, it'll spread from there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great advice. Great perspective. All right. So now, as you're looking forward to the new studio and the rest of this year and growing the podcast, what are you excited about for the future of Talking Church and the network?
Yeah, I'm excited about a lot of things. I'm excited for that new studio that we'll just be able to, do episodes and release them quicker, which is exciting. I'm actually starting to reach out to guests that I'm getting no's from, and I'm actually excited about that. It hurts in the moment, but I think that means that I'm reaching out to people that are high quality people, And so I think it's helpful to have like a archive of, hey, here's some really high quality guests that we've had. But if you don't get any no's, I feel like maybe you're not stretching yourself high enough. And so I've gotten more no's this year than I have in the past several years. And I think it's because I'm starting to reach for people that I don't even know that would want to talk to me, but I'm surprised, that there are others. And again, I'm privileged that we have a church that brings in great guest speakers and I get the chance to have them. But there are people starting to reach out to me. Hey, I'd be curious if ever I could be on the podcast. And so I'm excited for that there's just people that are listening, even guests that I've had in the past that say, I listened to this. I'm like, what? Like, you listened to my podcast? That's crazy. I wanted you to be a guest on here. So those are things that are exciting. And then within the network, we're just continuing our mission to train those 10,000 churches to give that $1 billion. And we're continuing to move forward. I just got back earlier this week at an event that we're training pastors to raise more money for missions. And so we're going to do that. Our conference is happening in the summer every year. So I would love people to join from that whenever they're listening. If you're a pastor or church leader and you want to go on an adventure with God and give his money away and say, hey, what could God do in my life and my church? We'd love to be a part of that.
Yeah. We'll throw a link to that in the show notes for sure. All right. Well, as we come to the end of the episode, we're going to jump into the high pass segment where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So first one here is, what's your favorite hobby to do in your spare time?
Woodworking. I would say like golf and woodworking, but like golf isn't even like a hobby to me. It's like a way of life. So when I say hobby is more like where I separate myself. And so I would say woodworking. I love making desks, tables. Actually, the podcast table that is in our studio, I handmade in my garage. And so that's something that I really go to escape. And then with friends, I like to golf.
Nice. So what are you working on woodworking wise right now?
I'm working on setting up my shop because I just moved into a new house. And so I don't have any current projects. Man. I'm going to build a dining room table and I'm going to probably build a couple things for some friends, but I actually need to set up my whole shop. So I'm super excited to unpack boxes and we literally just moved in. So I'm itching to get something started. I think I'm going to build a piano seat because we just bought a new piano at our house. And so I said, don't buy a chair. I want to build it. So
nice, man. That's really cool. All right. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how Talking Church has impacted their life?
I would say even from this last week, just somebody coming up to me and saying, I listened to every episode and my confidence has grown so much in ministry from this. There's a lot of young people that see me having conversations with people that are older than me and more experienced and just say it's helped them. So hearing that from him to say this has grown my confidence in ministry is super rewarding.
Nice. All right, last question in the High Pass segment. What's your favorite ministry podcast to listen to? Or what's your favorite ministry that you wish had a podcast?
I feel like my favorite ministry podcast, I think I really do like Craig's podcast, the leadership podcast, because I think he reaches such a wide audience and it helps me to just think about what people in our church are thinking about. I think a ministry that I think would be awesome to have a podcast is I wish that there were friends in ministry. Like, I'm in a lot of networks like the ARC network, and there's just a lot of guys that have great friends. And I think there's so many great leaders that would have awesome podcasts. And honestly, I've seen a lot of them have podcasts in the past, but they haven't sustained it just due to the busyness of life. And so I think it would be fun to have guys who've been friends in ministry for 30 or 40 years. I can think of a few, off the top of my head that my dad has been friends with. Even him, I've said, Dad, you should have a podcast. He's like, I'm too busy. So now I just have him on about once a month. But I think there are a lot of people that are older that think, young people don't want to hear from me. They really do. Those are actually some of the podcasts that I think are growing way more, is people who are older. Some of our most listened to episodes are some of our older guests. And so I think anyone who's older who feels like this is a young man's game or a young girl's game, I just think it's completely the opposite. And of course, technology can be a limiting factor, but if you can find someone that maybe can help you in confidence in that area, or if you feel great too, you have a lot of wisdom to lend to the next generation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that is an area that I've also seen that like there's so much wisdom from folks that have gone before us. Podcasting is a great medium to be able to learn from them. And so, yeah, that's great. All right. Well, as we close, Logan, what's your best advice for ministry leaders who are on the fence right now about starting a podcast for their ministry?
Get a good microphone. I think just do it is the starting point. I've done 3 podcasts. The first 2 failed. I did one that lasted 3 episodes and one that lasted about 7. And so my third one, right, is the one that kind of finally, but the difference was, I don't think the podcast, I think it was I remained consistent in it. People start stuff all the time. And what other people and your friends are looking at is, do you believe in yourself enough to keep it going? And I think a lot of people see this initial jump because it's your first podcast episode and you get all your friends that watch, you get all your family that watches, and you think, this is great. And it's just like a church launch, or it's just like a business grand opening. It goes down, 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 and then you find your floor and you have to build from there. And most people quit when they hit their floor. And I would just encourage, get started. But if you really believe in this, you have to give it at least a year. In the podcasting space, a month or 2 months is nothing. You know, I'm 3 years in and I still feel like, man, I haven't been doing it that long. And then I look, I'm on episode like whatever I'm at, 100 and something. That's crazy. But it's taken me week after week. And I've remained very consistent to not miss a week. If I do a rewind from a former episode, or I try to take something from our network or conference and repurpose it. But I don't want our audience to miss a week and say, I'm busy. They're listening every single week. I want to honor them for their listening. And it's like a restaurant when you show up to Chick-fil-A on a Sunday and you go, no, like I was craving Chick-fil-A and it's closed on Sunday. Well, how sad if people are looking forward to what you have to say and you go, oh, I'm too busy. And so find a cadence and stick to it and just do it longer than you think. And if you're not prepared to do it for the long haul, then I wouldn't get started in the first place.
Yeah, that's great advice, Logan. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to share about your podcast journey with Talking Church with my audience. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I really enjoyed my conversation with Logan and getting to hear the backstory of starting the podcast, Talking Church, and how it's been a great way to amplify the mission and grow the ministry of River Valley Network. You can listen to Talking Church with the link in the show notes. Now, it was great to hear about Logan's 2024 goals for his podcast and what it's going to take to achieve them. So that made me curious, do you have any goals for your podcast this year? Or is your goal to start a podcast this year? Either way, I'd love to hear what you're working towards. Send me a message on Instagram or LinkedIn. Both are linked at the bottom of the show notes, and let me know what they are. I'd love to read them, and with your permission, of course, share them on the podcast to encourage you and give other listeners ideas of goals that they could be setting for their own podcast. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, text it to a friend or share it on social media. Together, we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. And if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on the next episode, and leave a 5-star review while you're at it. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Adam Griffin, one of the hosts of the Family Discipleship Podcast. Adam and I are going to talk about his passion for family discipleship, how he makes time to host the podcast alongside being the lead pastor at Eastside Community Church, and his experience hosting a live recording of their podcast. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.